Psalm 106 is a counterpart to Psalm 105. Psalm 105 is a very positive account of Israel's history, where Psalm 106 is a negative account. It's a recital of Israel's faithless history. It's an historical psalm, one of three of these, Psalm 78, 105, and 106. Psalm 106 is more similar to Psalm 78, although it's about two-thirds in the length. Both of them recite Israel's history of sin. Both begin with an extended introduction. Both recount episodes of Israel's history in non-chronological order. It can be viewed as a historical commentary on the great psalm of God's covenant love, Psalm 103. So 103 tells us the greatness of God's love. Psalm 106 tells us how, unfortunately, we've often responded to that with faithlessness. As the final psalm of Book 4, it acknowledges that Israel is responsible in part for the exile that she suffers. But it's also a reminder that God's divine love, like his kingship, his strength, his justice, his holiness, his glory, his wisdom, are everlasting. And that is the larger context in which human sin finds itself. The psalm begins with praise with a hallelujah, the opening word, hallelujah. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Who can utter the mighty deeds of the Lord or declare his praise? Blessed are those who observe justice, who do righteousness all the time. So there's a mocharism, a statement of blessing. There are 26 of these in the Psalms. And the proposition is stated that if we observe justice and do righteousness, we will be blessed. There is a blessing in keeping the covenant. Now, Psalm 105 reminded us that God remembered his covenant. The psalmist here prays, Lord, remember me. And of course, by remember, we mean act. God, do something. Don't just think, oh yeah, I remember that guy. No, it means do something. Remember me when you show favor to your people, when you help me, when you save them. And he's hoping here, praying for God to restore them from the exile. So he is offering a prayer here that is very future-oriented, that God would remember and act on his behalf. Verse 6 is the acknowledgement of Israel's sin. Both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity. It is a confession. It is a statement. God, have mercy on me. I am a sinner. We have done what is wicked. Then the psalmist will recount 8 episodes showing Israel's forgetfulness of God's divine love. Each of those will show some aspect of Israel's rebellion, and then God's justice upon that, and ultimately his mercy in remaining faithful to his covenant. So there's a cycle with each one of these: Israel's rebellion, God's justice, and ultimately his mercy. First of these is by the Red Sea. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but rebelled by the sea, at the Red Sea. They doubted. They were ready to go back. God, have you just brought us out here to the sea to let us be killed? We're trapped against the sea. But God rebuked the sea, became dry. He saved them, destroyed the hand of their enemies. They believed his words. They sang his praise. So God acted. God demonstrated his mercy, even though they had complained. Well, they soon forgot his works, and they did not wait for his counsel, and they craved food in the wilderness, and their stomachs became their gods. And so God put them to the test into wasting disease. So there's God's judgment upon them. The next was in the camp. There was a leadership crisis, and they were jealous of Moses and Aaron. And then you had the rebellion, God's justice engaged there as fire broke out, flame burned up the wicked. Number 4, at Mount Sinai, or Horeb, they made a calf. They worshipped a metal image, exchanged the glory of God for an ox. They forgot God and the great things he had done, his works, his awesome deeds by the sea. They'd forgotten this, and therefore God said he'd destroy them. But Moses, here's an act of mercy, stood in the breach, and God turned away his wrath from destroying them. So God's judgment and mercy both engaged there. Verse 24, they despised the pleasant land, having no faith in his promise. So they're prepared to enter the promised land. They send spies ahead of them, but 10 of the 12 spies come back and say, we can't do it. We can't take them. I mean, this is an awesome place. It's just like God promised, but they're giants. We can't do it. And so their lack of faith resulted in God's judgment, and they were forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. The next example cited is the worship at Baal Peor. They ate sacrifices offered to the dead. So plague broke out. Then God's mercy intervened. The plague was stayed. and that was counted to Phinehas as a righteousness for generation forever. The next example is by the waters of Meribah, where they complained. They went ill with Moses on their account, for he spoke his bitter spirit. This is Moses sinning here at this point, judgment coming upon them. But he did not. They didn't destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded. They mixed with the nations. They served idols. And this resulted in apostasy in the promised land. Specifically here, they sacrificed their sons and daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters. They sacrificed the idols of Canaan. The land was polluted with blood. Human sacrifice. Pagan worship in that period involved human sacrifice, specifically the sacrifice of children, where someone might offer their child, their firstborn perhaps, as a sacrifice to gain greater fertility, whether the land or whether of children. Of course, we don't have to look too far to see this same thing today. Even though we're quite modern, we have the moral evil of abortion by law in our country that allows people to sacrifice their children for their selves, essentially. It's been said that you can judge the values or the health of a culture by how they treat their children. I got to say, we don't treat our children well in this culture, not only through legalized abortion, but also no-fault divorce that makes it easier to break up families, which has irreparable harm to children. And most recently, same-sex marriage and even the adoption, now creation of children through surrogacy for the benefit of the parent. Children are of value in themselves, and when you have children, your focus in life should rightly switch towards your children to serve them and to raise them up. But too often people have children, they use children to get something for themselves. That's not what God designed. So I digress a bit there, but I think it's too easy for us to point our finger at Israel and say, wow, how could they possibly have done this when we've got fingers pointing back at ourselves as well for how we disgracefully treat children in our culture. As we move to the conclusion of this psalm, we see a summary statement that God's anger kindled against his people. He abhorred his heritage. He gave them into the hand of the nations, those that hated and ruled over them. So this could be a reference, very likely as a reference to the exile, the conquest of Judah by Babylon. I mean, first it was Assyria to the north, taking the northern kingdoms, and then the southern kingdom by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and essentially where they are now when the psalm is being written, in captivity in Babylon. And here's kind of a summary statement. They were rebellious in their purposes. They were brought low through their iniquity, even though many times God delivered them. So there's a pattern here. There's a cycle of history that keeps repeating itself. Nevertheless, he looked upon their distress when he heard their cry. For their sake, he remembered his covenant. He relented according to the abundance of his steadfast love. So there is God's mercy intervening once again. He caused them to be pitied by all who held them captive. And the psalm will conclude then with a prayer to save us, gather us from the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. So it's a prayer for restoration. The people have been scattered. They were scattered first by the Assyrian invasion of the north in 722 BC, and then again by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And the Jews were scattered then and even in subsequent centuries by various wars. And so this is a prayer for gathering, for restoration, for return to the land by the grace of God. Israel acknowledged, hey, we own this. We violated the covenant, and God rightfully punished us for that. But now, God, in your mercy, would you restore us? And that is a fantastic way to end Book 4, because Book 4 was compiled for use during the exile. And so we end with this plea, God, would you restore us based on the way you have treated us in the past? We know of your steadfast love, your faithfulness, and your mercy, so restore us. And the psalm ends there with verse 47. Verse 48, of course, is a doxology to Book 4. So it wraps up the entire book. And notice that it takes us back to the very first verse of Book 4. That is Psalm 90, verse 1, that God is the everlasting God. He is our dwelling place from generation to generation, from everlasting to everlasting. He is God. And so we end with a recognition of the eternal nature of God and a reminder of his faithfulness and his steadfast love to his covenant and to his covenant people.